So thanks, Fede, and everyone for having me today. I'm super happy to present this paper at the Bank of Chile. This paper is entitled Government Procurement and Access to Credit, Firm Dynamics and Aggregate Implications, and it's joint work with Julian Di Giovanni from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Preet Ginas from UPF, Enrique Moral from Bank of Spain, and Josep Pijon Mas from FEMFI. So in this paper, we're going to be talking about the macroeconomic effects of public procurement. Just to tell you a few numbers, public procurement accounts for a significant fraction of the economy. Depending on the year and country you're looking at, this can go from 10%, for example, in the case of the US, to 15% in the case of some European countries. So what we're going to emphasize in this paper that procurement can be a powerful policy tool. First, because it's big, as you can see from these numbers, and second, because governments usually have a lot of discretion in terms of from which firms they're going to buy. Okay, and something that is important to emphasize as well is that procurement is not only a construction phenomenon. Usually we have in mind that this is all about building bridges and building highways, but actually construction is very spread out across many industries in the economy. So governments buy from toilet paper to medical equipment, from cars to uniforms for the police. So they buy a lot of things from many industries. So not only governments buy from many industries, but they also buy from a variety of firms. Okay, so this is not only a phenomenon for big firms, and actually in our data, we're going to show that there is a big overlap in terms of firm size, okay, in terms of what are the firms that sell to governments. And there is actually an active policy debate that comes from regulation in the case of the US, but also from the debate in the policy cycles in Europe about whether governments should target specific firms when buying goods and services. In other words, there should be kind of any industrial policy that governments should follow that is telling them whether they should buy relatively more from big firms versus small firms. So in this paper, we're going to be answering the question, what are the macroeconomic effects of allocating procurement to firms with different characteristics? And in particular, we're gonna just do the following thought experiment, which is imagine the government wants to spend 12% of GDP. Okay, so imagine you fix the amount of expenditure, whether the government should target some firms or others. Okay, whether government should actually focus more on buying from small firms or from big firms or from firms that are financially constrained or from firms that are maybe growing more than others. Okay, so that's the idea. Fix the amount of expenditure, whether the allocation across firms matters in understanding the macroeconomic effects of government procurement. We're going to emphasize that in order to understand that question, it's going to be very important to focus on three different channels. The first channel is going to be selection. Okay, we're going to be thinking about what are the firms that have incentives to sell to the government, and also those firms that are capable to sell to governments, because we're going to kind of assume that selling to governments is kind of costly from the firm's perspective. Then we're going to be thinking, once a firm sells to the government, what is going to be the impact on this firm? Okay, how the firm is going to be affected by this treatment when the treatment is actually becoming a supplier of the government. And then third, and more importantly, we're going to be thinking about, once you aggregate all these selection and treatment effects, what are going to be the macroeconomic consequences of this government procurement? We're going to be focusing on one particular mechanism through which we think that firm dynamics and procurement interact in being important for the macroeconomy, which is the fact that selling to the government may increase firms' borrowing capacity. So the idea is that, and this is at the core of the hypothesis or at the justification for why governments should target the small firms. The idea is that small firms, when selling to governments, are going to be able to accumulate assets faster, so they're going to be able to grow faster, which is going to lead them to be bigger in the future, and this may be potentially good for the TFP of the economy and for aggregate productivity. So that's kind of the idea. To be more concrete about what we have in mind, we're going to be thinking about this type of collateral constraints. So here we're going to have LT, which is how much a firm can borrow at a given point in time. Okay, this is firm debt. And we're going to assume that firm debt is going to be a function of firm's assets, okay, as is standard in the literature. How much a firm can borrow depends on the amount of capital that the firm has. And we're also going to allow this constraint to be a function of firm's earnings, okay? So these two components, the blue and the red, are going to be capturing the amount of cash flows that the firm has at this point in time, okay? Whether the firm is being very successful in the business operations. And we're going to allow for these earnings to be different depending on whether they come from selling to the private sector, okay, or selling to the public sector. So as opposed to kind of microfound why this phi G may be bigger than phi P, okay, we're gonna try to provide some evidence to convince you that actually $1 that is sold to the government is going to be more pledgeable than $1 sold to the private sector. And this is going to be just one of the channels through which firms are going to grow faster whenever they sell to the government. But this is what we're going to kind of have in mind when thinking about how the government can help firms to grow faster. There's going to be a channel as well, which is not going to come directly from this constraint, which is the fact that selling to the government is going to allow firms to make more profits, and they're going to be able to accumulate these profits faster and then grow faster, which is kind of the same channel that people have in mind when thinking about this model of firm dynamics. Okay, but this is going to be on top of this constraint that I'm showing you right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to just proceed our analysis in 3 ways. One is going to be just building a new data set, which is going to be a kind of a new data set on procurement projects. So at a given point in time, we're going to be able to measure how much the firm is selling to the government. Okay, and we're going to merge this information with information about the standard balance sheet kind of data, which is going to let us measure at a given point in time how much a firm is selling to the government, as well as how much the firm is selling to the private sector. So we're going to be able to measure firm's composition in sales. And we're going to merge this information with credit registry for Spain. So this is going to allow us to measure at a given point in time how much the firm is borrowing from each specific bank. And also, as I will mention later, we're going to be able to say something about the composition of credit. And this comes back to the constraint I showed you before. We're going to be able to say whether a particular loan actually needed some type of tangible collateral. So we're going to be able to say what fraction of firm's credit is going to come from this asset base, which is borrowing against the assets, versus how much is coming from borrowing against the cash flows. And we're going to be able to see whether when selling to the government, the composition of this credit changes. Then we're going to just do some reduced form analysis, which is just going to be kind of a suggestive evidence for our mechanism, which is the fact that we're going to see that whenever a firm sells to the government, firm's credit is going to go up. Not only credit is going to go up, but also the composition is going to become more biased towards this earning base, which is kind of what I was emphasizing before. And also, we're going to be able to, for a subset of contracts, we're going to have information about auctions. So we're going to be able to measure the ranking of firms that were tightly competing for the same contract. So we're going to be able to exploit this kind of, winner versus second type of firm in the auction. And we're going to see whether there is some kind of interesting effect there, whether firms that get winner just by a little bit, whether they can actually get their credit increased after winning the auction. And then, and perhaps the main contribution of the paper is going to be trying to embed all this evidence into a firm dynamics model, which is going to be pretty standard. So for those of you who are familiar with the standard Midrigan-Shu type of style model, which is a model in which firms are heterogeneous in productivity, some of them are going to be constrained and they're going to be accumulating assets over time to escape out of these constraints. We're going to extend the model in 3 dimensions. First, we're going to assume that there is another sector to which firms can sell, and this sector is going to be the government sector. So we're just going to assume that there is a downward slope in demand by the government, and this government is going to be buying goods and services. So the firm potentially can sell to this government. Of course, this decision about whether to sell to the government or not is going to be endogenous. We're just going to assume that this decision is kind of costly. So firms are going to have to pay something that resembles pretty much a fixed cost. And then only some particular type of firms are going to be the ones that are going to optimally choose to sell to the government. Okay, that's going to be kind of a new dimension of our model. And then we're going to extend the standard borrowing constraint along the lines that I showed you before. So we're going to allow this collateral constraint to be a function not only on your assets, but also on the earnings. And these earnings can actually be decomposed into the earnings from selling to the private sector versus earnings coming from selling to the government. So this is kind of what we're going to do from a methodological point of view. So let me tell you about the main findings of the paper. So first, we're going to find that there are strong selection effects. And whenever I'm talking about these main results, this refers to both data and the model. Okay, but we're going to find that there is going to be a strong selection in both net worth and productivity. Okay, so in a model without financial frictions, the only thing that is going to matter in determining the incentives for a firm to participate into the government sector is going to be productivity. Why? Because productivity is going to measure the scale at which you can produce. Okay, if you're a very productive firm, you're going to be able to deliver very big contracts to the government. So then it's going to be worth it for you to pay this fixed cost that we're going to assume that is there. Okay, so this is going to be kind of the scale type of mileage effect that is going to be present in our model. Instead of thinking about the exporting sector, we're going to be thinking about the government sector. Now, in a model with financial frictions, productivity is not enough, okay, to predict the scale at which the firm can produce. Why? Because if the firm is financially constrained, it might be very productive, but if it doesn't have a lot of net worth, it's going to be constrained. So the scale at which it can produce is going to be very low. So in that sense, for productive firms, a variable that is going to matter for selection is net worth, because net worth is going to measure the extent to which firms can operate at a big scale. Okay, so that's going to be kind of the two variables that are going to drive selection in this model and in the data. What about treatment? So first, we're going to find that firms that sell to the government are going to increase their overall amount of credit. So they're going to be able to borrow more and they're going to be bigger. Okay, and that's kind of intuitive. When the firm sells to the government, the overall size of the firm is gonna increase. But we're going to find that there's going to be a crowding out effect. Okay, and the idea is that even if the firm can actually increase its credit, this increase in the amount of credit is not going to be enough to eliminate the firm's financial frictions. So selling to the government is not going to allow the firm to become financially unconstrained, unless the parameters are crazy. But this is nothing that we find in our calibration. Okay, so under reasonable parameters, you sell to the government, but you're still going to be constrained. Okay, and if you're still going to be constrained, what the firms are going to do is actually reducing the amount of output that they sell to the private sector. Okay, so the idea is that, imagine just for a second, the firm is completely financially constrained. The scale is fixed. So then when the firm can sell to a new market, what it's going to do, because of the total amount of resources the firm can use is fixed, it's going to somehow pull down some of the resources the firm was using to produce to the private sector and use them to produce for the public sector. So we're going to find that this is an effect on impact. Okay, but over time, we're going to find that because the firm is able to borrow more and accumulate more profits, actually the firm is going to become less constrained in the future. Okay, so this is going to be kind of a short run versus long run effect. In the short run, the firm is going to still be financially constrained, so it's going to have to decrease the amount of output in the private sector. There's going to be this crowding out. In the long run, this is kind of going to disappear, and actually the firm is going to be able to have kind of a crowding in. It's going to be able to use these new resources to actually increase the operations in the private sector. So this is short run versus long run effect that we find both in the data and in the model. Then we're going to try to think about the policy experiment. And we're going to carry out a very simple policy experiment today, which is, imagine the government wants to keep constant amount of expenditure, capital G. Imagine the government wants to spend 12% of GDP. So we're going to ask, what happens if the government starts making the contract smaller? Okay, so you take all these big contracts, you make them smaller, but you allocate them across small firms. Okay, and this is kind of what is being discussed in the European Parliament. The European Parliament, now in the context of COVID, they're saying we should really break down big projects into smaller projects so more firms can get access to them. And this is exactly what we're going to do in this experiment. So first, we're going to find that these small firms, these new firms that now can get access to these procurement projects, are going to be able to accumulate more assets and are going to be bigger in the new steady state. So this is something positive. So these firms are going to become less constrained. So this is going to help the small firms. And this is kind of one of the main narratives to justify why governments should buy from small firms. The fact that it's going to help these firms to grow faster and achieve scales which are going to be closer to their optimal scales in the long run. So our model is predicting that effect indeed. There's going to be a negative effect also in the short run, which is coming from this crowding out that I was describing before. In the short run, because firms are going to still be financially constrained, they're going to have to pull down the resources from the private sector and start using them to the public sector. So there's going to be a reduction in the amount of output in the private sector. And the idea is that because you start buying from smaller firms, you start buying from firms that are more financially constrained, what you are doing is changing the composition of firms from which you buy towards those firms that are on average more constrained. So the crowding out effect becomes more severe. So the idea is that in a world in which you only buy from unconstrained firms, because this crowding out is only present for constrained firms, this crowding out effect is absent. But if you start changing policies to target small firms, you are more likely to buy from constrained firms for which this crowding out effects are stronger. So that's the idea. And that's going to be a negative effect in the short run. We're also going to find a negative effect coming from big firms, which is going to be kind of a long run. type of effect. And this is the one that was less obvious when we started thinking about this model. So the idea is the following. So we're going to assume that selling to the government is going to be costly, but it's going to involve some uncertainty. Okay, and the way to think about it is the following. You're going to put some resources into the table, some kind of fixed cost. Okay, and this is basically going to be capturing, getting ready for the auction. You don't know how the auction works. You have to deal with paperwork. So you have to invest a lot of money in trying to win the auction. But it might be the case that you lose the auction. So there is some kind of uncertainty. Okay, and this extra degree of uncertainty in selling to the government, okay, this demand uncertainty is kind of a demand uncertainty, is going to introduce a new motive for capital accumulation through precautionary savings. So one of the reasons why firms accumulate savings in this economy is because they anticipate that they may actually become suppliers of the government. So they want to be ready. They want to make sure that if at some point they win an auction, they're not financially constrained. So that's one of the mechanisms through which firms actually accumulate assets. They just want to make sure that they are unconstrained in case this procurement shock comes. Now, in a world in which procurement projects are huge, okay, in a world in which, let's say, the government buys from a small fraction of firms but big projects, these firms anticipate that because of projects are huge, these demand shocks are very high. Okay, so they want to make sure that in case demand comes, they want to be ready. So they accumulate a lot of precautionary savings to make sure that they can actually deliver these big projects. Okay, even big firms, they want to be ready, so they accumulate this amount of assets to make sure they can deliver. In a world in which projects are very small, these incentives disappear from the point of view of big firms. They know that now in this new economy, which the European Commission is trying to push, this new economies, projects are very small. So they anticipate that they don't have to accumulate a lot of assets because even if they win the contract, they're going to be able to deliver because the contract is small. So they're never going to be financially constrained. So that's the idea. So these two effects, especially the third one, is going to drive capital accumulation down, which overall, when thinking about the interaction of these three effects, we're going to find that this type of policies tend to reduce GDP in the long run, okay? Mostly coming from this crowding out and this reduction in capital accumulation. So this is kind of the main result of the paper, that when doing this type of policies in terms of from which firms you buy, you have to take into account these crowding out effects as well as the decision by big firms, which also take into account the size of procurement contracts when taking saving decisions. That's kind of the main result of the paper. Now, whether we find a particular number or not is going to depend on the type of counterfactual. I will be more specific about it, but this is kind of the main result, that this type of policies may lead to reductions in GDP. Okay. Any questions about the mechanism, intuition, please?
Can I ask you something?
Yeah, sure.
Do you know how persistent are these kind of contracts with the government? I think that maybe this, you can think from the first perspective, you can think on this contract with the government as a productivity shock. No? So if this kind of contract with the government are kind of persistent. So if I am a firm and I got a contract now, and that I got a contract now, I will be able to get a contract easily, maybe in the future. I will try to accumulate faster now in order to be ready to take into account, to take advantage of this content. Kind of what happened with the self-financing channel, with productivity shocks that are very persistent, that you want to actually accumulate more when you got this persistent productivity shock.
No,
I don't know if there is something.
Absolutely. So let me start kind of answering you more at a conceptual level, and then I'll tell you the specifics about persistence. So at the conceptual level, this procurement type of shock in the model is very similar to the productivity shock, in the sense that it's something that you expect to happen, and you want to be ready when it happens. Again, in terms of productivities, if I expect to be very productive, I anticipate that I'm going to be constrained unless I accumulate assets. So here is the same. It's like, if I anticipate that I can sell to the government, I don't want to be constrained, because a demand shock at the end of the day is kind of isomorphic to a productivity shock. So it's the same idea. I want to make sure that if I get a demand shock in expectation, I want to accumulate assets to avoid being constrained. So this kind of the same mechanism. So this self-financing channel is going to be operating through demand coming from the government demand. Okay, this is kind of what at the conceptual level what is going on in the model. In terms of your specific question, government procurement contracts are indeed very persistent. Okay, and in our model is going to be able to generate the amount of persistence that we find in the data, at least to some extent. Okay, and this is going to be the case even if we are not mechanically fitting this persistence in the data. We're just going to find a lot of persistence because because of these selection effects, because the firms that tend to participate more are firms with more net worth and more productivity, and productivity and net worth are very persistent themselves. So somehow the persistence in productivity and net worth are going to be the ones that are going to create this endogenous amount of persistence in the relationship with the government. So at the end of the day, what we're going to do, we're going to compare the amount of persistence generated by the model compared to the amount of persistence generated by the data, and we're going to see how well the model does. But the model does pretty well, actually. So the answer is yes, the model is going to generate a lot of persistence, even though we're not fitting mechanically this persistence in the demand system. I will show you later. But yeah, that's the idea. But in terms of the self-financing channel, it's the same type of logic, and it's operating through demand as well as through productivity.
Manuel? One question, I mean, maybe you want to postpone this for later, but an alternative channel for which sort of this procurement contract can have an effect is due to sort of demand dynamics, right? So think about like a model with customer capital accumulation, and this is kind of a boost, and it helps firms reach more customers, even if they're not financially constrained. And I guess there are some papers that have been sort of suggesting that this is the case. This is paper in Brazil, although it's kind of just reduced form, but it's kind of pointing towards that direction. So I wanted to see your reaction in terms of like what moments in the data can help you discriminate between a financial friction story versus a demand dynamics story.
So absolutely. So this is a good point. So at the end of the day, there is, as you are saying, there is a lot of literature on spillovers from selling to a new market, right? It's like, so all of a sudden you're selling only to one market and then you sell to another market. What are the spillovers that are coming from these complementarities through capital accumulation in terms of customers or from many other channels? So what we find in the data and in the model is that at first there is a negative complementarity, okay? In the sense that you sell to the government, you reduce the amount of output that you sell to the private sector. And in principle, this could be consistent, for example, with increasing marginal cost, like this paper by Paul and Truss and co-authors and Edu Morales. They find that whenever a firm gets a negative shock in the domestic market, they start exporting more. And we just find exactly the same logic, but the reverse. And this could be just coming from this technology. And then we find the opposite in the long run. And in the long run, one of the stories may be one of the ones we're emphasizing. Okay, so something that helps us to discriminate is the fact that all these crowding out effects that we find, at least in the short run, are gonna interact with the amount of financial friction that the firm has. Okay, so somehow we're gonna find that the amount of spillovers, okay, is gonna be stronger the more financially constrained the firm is, which is what the model predicts. So this is like kind of this double diff in the data that help us to say something about, okay, this is going on, and this seems to correlate with the amount of financial frictions. Now, if the amount of financial frictions is a proxy for something else, then we cannot discriminate. Okay, but at least it goes in the right direction, in the sense that these complementarities across the different types of sectors, okay, in order to explain that complementarity, financial frictions seem to be a good proxy for explaining that. Now, there are better ways to discriminate these, probably yes. But I think we're going to find a lot of evidence that is consistent with the fact that this matters for financing. Together with this interaction, I think is good enough. But I agree with you that it's not obvious why financial friction should be at the core of the mechanism. There may be others, but this is the one we're emphasizing. I think we can try to isolate it properly, but we can talk about it later.
Okay.
Manuel,
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah. Just more, I think, more basic questions related to the definition of contracts. So I'm thinking on specificity and divisibility of this type of projects. So perhaps there are some projects that are more useful for governments than for the rest of the economy. And there is some specific supply of this by some firms. And also regarding to divisibility. So I'm thinking that when you try to buy public works, perhaps it's natural that there are a few firms that only sell to the government as compared to other type of projects that are more divisible, like toilet paper, as you said at the beginning. So how you treat this in your setting would be interesting to know. And about some confounding stories that there are regarding to selection. The nature of financial frictions could be change if you think on a supply type of story instead of a demand one. I'm thinking of a bank that because you are bigger, because you are getting some stable inflows from the government, then you get more access to credit. So that is the second question.
No, you guys are asking a lot of great questions. I mean, but I'm gonna try to answer them now, and then later, if somehow my answers they don't, so, you know, they don't answer the question that you're asking, and maybe later with more information you actually want to ask them again, feel free. So regarding your first question, you are totally right. So there are some sectors in which the government is the only buyer. The government is a monopsony. Think about nuclear weapons. So there are some, you know, private firms that produce weapons, and the government is the only buyer. So in that sense, this is very specific of the government. Now we're going to try to emphasize, and we kind of try to do it in the data, is we're going to try to emphasize that everything we're going to be talking about applies to some sectors in which both the private sector and the government sectors are kind of very important buyers. Okay. And potentially something that we can do in the future is say, okay, whatever counterfactual we run, let's focus on only the part of government procurement that is not nuclear weapons, because those we know that is very specific of the government, and maybe it doesn't make any sense to think about buying from more firms. Regarding the visibility, you are completely right again, in the sense that there might be some sectors in which, you know, breaking down projects may make more sense, like toilet paper. And there may be other sectors like building bridges in which maybe breaking projects into smaller projects doesn't make any sense. And again, we could actually try in the counterfactuals later on to make sure that we allow for this, you know, heterogeneity across sectors to the extent that this type of policy that we're talking about can be implemented in some sectors and not in others. This is not something we are currently doing, but I think it's relevant. And then regarding your third question, which I think is even more relevant, something we're going to do is we're going to exploit loan applications data. Okay, and you're saying something that makes perfect sense, which is, okay, when a firm gets a contract, this may not be about financial frictions. They just mean this may just be coming from the fact that the firm wants to increase the operations, which means that the firm wants to borrow more, and the firm may not be financially constrained, but we're still going to observe an increase in credit because the firm wants to demand more credit. So something we're going to do for that is looking at loan applications. So we're going to be looking at firms that apply for the same kind of loan from the same type of bank. And we're going to see that conditional on that application, which is kind of a demand for credit, we're going to see whether getting a procurement contract increases the probability of acceptance. We're going to see whether it is more likely, conditional on demand for credit, that you actually get the loan. And this is going to be kind of our discipline to say something about the financial frictions rather than just a credit demand story. Okay, so these loan applications are going to be helpful because somehow allow us to control for the amount of demand of credit. That's kind of the idea. But I will explain later more in detail.
Okay, thanks.
Manuel?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was a little bit late, so I don't know if you already mentioned it, but do you include some sort of transaction cost in the negotiation between the government and the number of firms? For example, you could imagine that it's harder for the government to negotiate with 1,000 small firms than with one firm that is 1,000 times bigger than the average. And the second one is I'm very interested or intrigued about the policy experiment, because here what you do is try to solve at the end of the day the symptom of financial constraint. You're saying firms are financially constrained, and that's why they cannot get bigger contracts. Have you thought of doing the opposite experiment of doing what would happen with the contracts if you reduce the financial constraint, or the problem that it's limiting their ability to get bigger contracts?
So thanks, Mario. So regarding the first question, again, I think this is very interesting, and we started thinking about it recently. This is not something we're taking into account, and I think you're right. Like, from the government point of view, if dealing with more firms involve more transaction costs, for example, renegotiations and more paperwork and more monitoring, then you are completely right. There may be an incentive through which government should buy from a limited number of firms, which is not present in our model. So basically, if you want to, the way you should think about your channel, which I think may be potentially relevant, is something that would go against what we find. That is, maybe governments want to buy from a smaller fraction of firms simply because they want to keep transaction costs low. Okay, and I'm sympathetic with that type of channel. We're not having that into our model, but I think this is important, especially when you ask to public officials. They say that dealing with many firms is kind of very costly because they have to keep track of all of them. So I think that's perfectly fine. Regarding your second question, we can talk about it more later, but it's going to be kind of present in our model. In our model, like if you were to give a firm kind of a shock of assets, if you just want to give some firm some assets, this firm actually will change the amount of contract that it's targeting. So in the model, it's going to be the case that firms that become less financially constrained are going to actually target different types of contracts in the economy. So imagine you were to take this model and just change the parameter that governs the financial frictions. Just through that, the amount of contracts and the size of contracts would actually change in this economy. So that's going to be present in our economy. It is true that we are not running that counterfactual precisely, but we could potentially do it with our model. So at the micro level, this is happening. When a firm becomes less constrained, the firm changes the amount of contracts that can deliver, but we're not doing this at the aggregate level. We're not doing the experiment. Let's decrease the amount of financial frictions for everyone. Let's see what happens with the procurement in this economy. That's not something we're doing, but I think it's interesting, but we could potentially do it.
Okay, thank you.
More questions? Great. Okay, so let me tell you about the...
Let's go over later.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're gonna have information about public procurement, and in particular, what we're gonna do is we're gonna scrape the Spanish central government's official bulletin. Okay, so this means that we're gonna have the universe of contracts awarded by the central government. Okay, because any institution that belongs to the central government is gonna have to advertise their government contracts in this bulletin. Okay, for the 2000-2013 period. On top of it, we're going to have some contracts awarded by other institutions, like, for example, regional governments, because even though they don't have the obligation to publish the information in this bulletin, they may want to do it because of advertisement reasons. Okay, we're going to have also those type of contracts. So what fraction of the total value of procurement we cover? We only cover 15% of the total value of procurement. Okay, so our micro data is nice in the sense that it has a lot of information, but it's not, it doesn't represent by any means all procurement contracts in Spain. Okay, we're going to emphasize that even though we don't cover 100% of the contracts, we do very well in matching like the general trends that we can just measure from national accounts, but still, this is one limitation from the data. So for all contracts, we're going to have information about the type of project, the agency awarding the contract, the awarded firms, and many other things. And for a subset of contracts, around 1,000, we're going to have information about the auction. We're going to know what were the firms competing. So that's going to allow us to construct the final ranking and exploit this winner versus second firm that I was mentioning at the beginning. So we're going to merge this information with standard balance sheet data for Spanish firms. And this is going to allow us to say something about the firm's operations, both in the private sector and in the public sector. And finally, we're going to have the universe of loans in Spain. And it's going to be at the firm bank month level. So for a given firm, at a given point in time, we're going to have the history of loans. Okay, and importantly, we're going to be able to say something about the type of loan. We're going to be able to say something about whether the firm needed some tangible collateral for this loan or not. So this is going to be our proxy for asset base, okay? And the rest of loans are going to be our proxy for earning base. And just to tell you, how important these type of loans are in the data is very controversial. So now there is this new literature emphasizes that earning base represent 80% of corporate loans in the US. There is a lot of discussion whether this is properly measured or not. We're just going to use proxies, okay? We're going to try to see whether the composition changes as opposed to taking directly this information and plugging into the model. I will explain later how we do it. And finally, as I was mentioning before, I think to Mario, we're going to use loan applications. And that's going to be important because that way we're going to be able to claim that this is coming from supply of credit rather than simply coming from demand and the desire of firms to increase their scale. So some summary statistics very fast. We're going to find that there is a lot of procurement outside construction. So around 80% of the contracts are outside construction. So construction is not the only sector that matters. We're also going to find that there is a high presence of small firms. Okay, and there is a big overlap. So this is against this kind of widespread view that procurement contracts is only about the firms. This is not the case in our data. We know this is not the case in the US, for example. So small firms are pretty active actually into procurement.
Manuel?
Yeah.
Quick question regarding the data.
Please.
In the previous slide, do you have the awarding mechanism? I'm thinking of the same argument that you make for credit, that you could do that the same thing if you had the information of the ones that didn't get the contract, or the ones that made a bid but didn't get the procurement contract.
Yeah, good point. So I don't know whether this is exactly what you're asking, but we're gonna do kind of this placebo type of experiment. So we're gonna compare the winner versus the second and the rest, and we're gonna find an effect. And then we're gonna see whether when you exclude the winner and you only compare the second versus the third and the others, whether there is some effect. Whether the ranking in the auction itself matters. Like for example, a signaling device. The fact that you are second, this sends a good proxy for the bank. And even though you are not winning the contract, you actually are getting more credit. And we find no effect. So we find that the ranking itself doesn't matter. What really matters is winning. I don't know whether this is what you're asking, but this is what we do.
Yeah, that works.
Okay.
May I ask a complementary question?
Please, Ernesto. Yeah.
It's about the type of contracts or the terms of the contracts in the sense of, are these contracts, the auction is on price only or on some characteristic that are aggregated somehow? And whether the contracts is really to provide some good and service or service in a given period of time, or it's another type of contract. For instance, in the US, it's very common that very large projects tend to have a different type of contract than the usual contract. They just, it's not about price, and it's not about paying the lower price. It's about the margin over cost.
No, absolutely. So two important points. In terms of the auctions, I think no auction is only about pricing. At least like the 1,000 type of projects we went through, like the documentation, we didn't find that any auction that is only based on price. Okay, in many auctions, in most of them, price matters and is one of the items of the final ranking of the firm, but it's only one of them. So usually what you have is pricing that matters for 50%. Then you have something like quality requirements, adaptability. So you have like many different items that changes a lot depending on the agency, that changes a lot depending on the size of the contract, and changes a lot over time. So the procurement system is extremely complex. And that's why we're going to have to take shortcuts in how we model it. Because if you want to actually go specifically project by project, you wouldn't write a macro paper. And that's what we want to push. So in terms of the data, asking your question, what we do is just focus on the final ranking, which may be the result of pricing, adaptability, and many other things, but we just focus on the final ranking. So basically the final ranking consists on giving some points that are the result of aggregating all these different items, and that's what we use. So regarding your second question about the conditions, the type of contracts, first, it's important to emphasize that most of the contracts, I think 70% for Spain and 90% for the US, are 1 year contract or less. So many of the contracts that you find in the data are about, okay, you give me some toilet paper, I pay you, and that's it. And this is most of the contracts. Of course, these contracts tend not to be the biggest one, but they tend to be the ones that are more frequent. So most of the contracts, they're very short run in nature.
That's something else that is related to what we, in the previous slide, you gave us the impression that the mechanism here is about scale. But then, if we look at the data, a lot of contracts are relatively small. It seems that there is a lot of turnover too across firms. So I'm not sure whether it's really about scales. Also, in this polynomial that typically are used to make points to do the rankings, price is usually has a big weight, not 100%, but pretty big. So I'm not exactly sure how to square the story about scales with the data that it's about most of the contracts about small scale, especially the type of contract that that have the terms that you're thinking of.
Okay, so there is so first of all, I mean, I'll show you some data on contracts, and we can take a look at exactly the numbers. So there are many small contracts, that's true, but there are other contracts that are big. So depending on how financially constrained the firm is going to get access to some contracts or others. But what is important, even if you think about the toilet paper example, there are a lot of variation in the scale. For example, if you think about the local municipality or a small university is going to buy, let's say, I'm just making this up, but it's going to buy 5 boxes of toilet paper. But maybe if you just sell into the Bank of Spain, the Bank of Spain is gonna buy 1,000 boxes of toilet paper. So we find a lot of variation in the data. So that's the way we want to think about the scale. Like if you're a firm that is financially constrained, you can only deliver to the municipality that is buying 5 boxes. But if you're a big firm of toilet paper and you are not financially constrained, you can deliver to the Bank of Spain that is buying 1,000 boxes of toilet paper. So I think in the data we find enough variation, okay, to say something about scale, even within very narrowly defined products. And that's what we want to emphasize. So even though there are many small contracts, there are many others that are big. And it's precisely the point of financial friction, which through the lens of the model makes firms to specialize in some contracts or others. And that's kind of what we want to push. And regarding pricing, that's something that is going to be present in our model as well. So those firms that are going to be able to charge lower prices are going to be the ones that are going to actually be able to deliver more projects, because the government is going to have a downward slope in demand. So the government is going to like lower prices. And that's going to be one of the channels through which this is going to operate. And this is where productivity matters in the model. Those firms that are more productive are going to be the ones that are going to be able to charge lower prices. And hence, this is where selection is coming. So it's actually scale and pricing is operating at the same time in the same direction. Those firms that charge lower prices are more productive and are going to be able to deliver bigger projects. And then financial frictions is going to start into playing, because somehow it's going to constrain the amount of scale and the amount of low price that you can charge if you're financially constrained. But I think the two things square very much, according to my point of view, but I'm willing to discuss it later. Okay, let me just show you something about the projects. Okay, no, this is not. Okay, the projects, just to come back to the Ernesto's question. So you see, like, for example, in supplies, the median contract is around 370,000 euros. Okay, so that's kind of the median contract. Okay, so is this big, is small? I don't think this is huge. It's kind of a contract that a firm could actually deliver, pretty easily. But you're going to have contracts that are huge. For example, I mean, just look at the 99 percentile. This is very extreme. But what I'm trying to emphasize that even when you look at within a sector, although this is not super disaggregated, but you can go further, you're going to find a lot of dispersion in the size of the contracts. And from our story perspective, firms, depending on how financially constrained they are, they're going to be able to deliver some or the others, depending on the scale at which they can operate. Okay, something that is also important, firms that sell to the governments, they tend to be big, although there is a lot of overlap in firm size, and they also tend to rely more on this earning-based type of credit. Okay, so firms that sell to governments, even though they have more assets, they're going to be borrowing much more against their earnings than against their assets as a fraction of total credit for these firms. Okay, reduced form. So first, how much time do I have?
You have 30 minutes to go, a bit more than
30 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to go fast in the reduced form. I mean, I'm super willing to talk as long as you guys want later, but I think this discussion has been great. So we're finding that winning a procurement contract increases firms' credit. That's kind of a very kind of just simple correlation. We're going to find that winning a procurement contract is going to change the composition of credit. As I was saying before, when you win a procurement contract, not only your credit goes up, but also your credit becomes more biased towards this earning base, which is consistent with the story that we have in mind. Then coming back to this question about supply versus demand, okay, we find that this seems to increase, this change in credit seems to be the result of firms increasing its borrowing capacity. And we have two pieces of evidence to emphasize that. First is that this relationship between the change in credit and procurement is stronger for firms that are more financially constrained. And we just use proxies like, for example, age and net worth. And those are kind of good proxies through the lens of our model. And second, we actually exploit this loan applications type of dimension, which is what I was mentioning before. Okay, it's conditional on the firm applying for a loan. What is the probability the firm gets the loan, depending on whether the firm has a procurement contract or not. Then we're going to find, and I will postpone this specific point for later because it's going to come directly from the model. We're going to emphasize that we have a strategy to actually claim that this Fiji is bigger than VP. The fact that $1 you sell to the government is going to be more pledgeable than $1 that you sell to the government, to the private sector. And to do that, we just make sure that when we look at procurement contracts, we see that leverage increases much more than when actually you sell to the private sector. Okay, and I will talk about it more later, but we have kind of a strategy which comes from the model to identify these two parameters that are going to be kind of important. And about the dynamic effect, so we're going to find that there is a positive permanent effect on firms' capital accumulation. Okay, so we see that when the firm gets a contract, over the years, these firms increases the ability to accumulate assets, okay, using kind of local projection methods. And we also find that there is a short-run crowding out effect and a long-run crowding out in the private sector. So for example, I really wanted to show this graph because it's kind of new. So here we're going to have this type of regression. Is local projection is somehow how obtaining a procurement contract in period T is going to affect output variable in period T plus 1, T plus 2, T plus 3, T plus 4. So it's kind of very standard local projections method. And this X variable can be either firm's total sales, so this is firm's total revenue, or firm's sales to the private sector. Okay, and what we find is that immediately after getting the contract, the firm is going to increase the operation. So the firm is going to sell more overall. And this is putting together sales to the private sector and sales to the government. And what we see is that for the private sector, we find this kind of crowding out effect in the short run and then kind of a recovery in the long run. And this type of graph, by the way, is very similar to other results that people have found, for example, in the case of Costa Rica, of firms selling to multinationals. When a firm starts selling to a multinational, they find that these firms actually decrease the amount of sales to domestic firms in the short run, and in the long run, there's kind of a recovery. So we kind of find the same type of effect, but when selling to the government. And this is going to be captured in our model, both the kind of asset accumulation in the long run, crowding out effect in the short run, and crowding in effect in the long run as well. So this is kind of the pieces of evidence that we have. Now let me jump into the model. Okay, any questions about empirics? I know I was fast, but I really want to focus on the modeling, what is left for the presentation. Okay, guys, Enzo?
Yes, Manu, I had one question regarding this. So especially about with this comparison between having access to multinational firms and so on. I think there are like kind of two stories here, because if I understood the empirical design is a bit like comparing winners versus the next one. So it's really about the next contract that you win. But there is a story about getting access to the procurement market. So basically firms that transition from not being able to serve this market to finally being able to enter it, paying these fixed costs and starting to do business with the government. So I guess it goes back to the question of persistence or whether it's an incumbent advantage. So basically the idea of whether when I compare two firms that maybe have been getting these contracts regularly for a long while, the effect of the marginal contract in terms of having access to finance and so on is going to be comparable or really the same as the one we would think for a firm that just gets its first contract.
And so this is a great question, actually. So let me because it has a lot of important content. So let me answer in parts. So first, I think that there is something fundamentally important about this idea of getting into the procurement market versus selling one contract. Okay, and the way we think about it is that you may invest some resources, and I will be very specific about it, to increase the probability of selling one contract. And then these resources that you invested, they may actually become a kind of a stock of capital that you have. So you become better to sell to the government because you understand how the procurement project works, you understand how politicians work, you understand how paperwork works. And this kind of a stock of capital that the firm accumulates over time. And that's the way you could actually think about this, becoming better in the market as opposed to getting one contract. So the way we're going to model this is not exactly like that. We're just going to say, you put some resources on the table. If you win a contract, then that's fine. If you don't win a contract, then you lose all this capital. So there is no this kind of stock of capital accumulation in the sense of becoming better in selling to the government. Conceptually, I think what you're saying is important. We're not capturing that into the model. We could. And the reason why we are not doing it is because the model already generates enough persistence so that we feel that this stock of capital in being good in selling to the government is not necessary for our purposes. Now, in the empirics, we have tried many different ways. For example, in the baseline regressions, we only focus on firms that have at least one contract. So all the variation is coming, in your language, is coming across firms that are already into the market, and we just exploit variation about getting one contract more. Okay, this is in the baseline regressions. Now, we run other regressions in which we put in all the firms together, meaning that we are mixing up the two types of effects you are mentioning, the one about getting into the procurement market and also getting an extra contract. And then we have another set of regressions in which we focus on firms that were born in 2005, that didn't have any procurement contract until 2010. And we just look at the effect of the firm getting the first contract versus the firm never getting a contract, which is somehow comparing within the firms that were never into the procurement market before. And we find actually kind of similar effects. So we don't find that the estimates are dramatically different. But I agree with you that conceptually it matters and empirically it may matter as well. Conceptually, we are aware of it and we think it's not necessary at this point, but we can discuss later in the context of the model. Empirically, we try to control for it and we don't see a lot of action, but I think it's a super relevant question. Okay, so very standard model in the sense that we're gonna allow firms to be heterogeneous in productivity. Productivity is gonna be persistent, and they're gonna accumulate assets to actually overcome these financial constraints. So we're gonna allow for this new market, okay, which we're gonna model as a downward sloping demand. Again, this is gonna be abstracting from a lot of complexity that is into the procurement market, because we really want to write a macro paper. And if we wanted to take care of all the complexity, we will be writing kind of a very micro paper. And there are many great papers on that dimension. We're gonna allow for this decision of selling to the government to be endogenous. So firms are gonna pay kind of a fixed cost, and I will be more precise about it, to sell to the government. And we're gonna allow for these constraints to be earning-based as well as asset-based. So we're going to extend the financial constraint along the lines I showed you at the very early stage of the introduction. So first, we're going to assume that there are two public goods. So the way you should think about it is private goods. A final private good is standard. The final public good is safety, health, whatever. Okay. So regarding the private good, everything is going to be very simple. We're going to assume that there is a mass of firms that is fixed, that are going to produce variety. So YIP is the variety produced by firm I, okay? And this mass of firms are going to be fixed. So selling to the private sector is not costly. So all firms are going to sell a little bit of their variety. Regarding the public sector, two things are going to be different. First, the subset of firms that sell to the government is going to be endogenous. So this IG is going to be the subset of firms among all the firms in the economy that are going to end up selling to the government. And I'm going to be very precise about how this is determined in equilibrium. But the way you should think about it right now is that only a subset of firms are going to be the ones selling to the government. How big this subset is? Well, the mass or the measure of this subset is going to be MG. And why is MG here in front of this parenthesis? Because we want to get rid of variety effects. Okay, and this is something that we go back and forth. People tell us to keep it. People tell us to remove it. We just want to make sure that selling to more firms is not going to increase output and productivity, just mechanically coming from the variety effect that you usually have in these models. And that's why we are just putting an MG here. So we are getting rid of the variety effect, okay? Just to get rid of that effect. I'm going to explain very well later how this IG is determined. So we're going to assume that firms are heterogeneous in productivity S, and they just use one factor of production, which is K. This productivity is going to follow a persistent process. Is going to be very persistent, like in the lines of Midring and Shu. So there is actually going to be very low levels of misallocation in this economy. So the firm is going to actually face two downward sloping demands. One downward sloping demand by the private sector and one downward sloping demand by the public sector. And this is the idea that firms that are more productive, they're going to be able to charge lower prices, so they're going to be more active in procurement because the government is going to be willing to buy more from these firms. And this BP and BG are going to be kind of the level of demand, which are going to be kind of endogenous in the model. They're going to depend on these relative prices and the amount of demand by the two types of agents in this economy, like the private sector and the government. Okay, so this slide is very important. So what about public procurement? So the government, we're going to assume that has two targets, okay, two objectives. The first objective is the level of demand, YG, and this is going to be kind of a parameter, okay? We're going to use this parameter to calibrate the 12%. Okay, this is how much the government wants to buy goods and services. Okay, so that's going to be the level of demand by the government. And then it has a lot of another objective, which is IG. Okay, IG is the subset of firms from which you buy. Okay, so the government is going to choose the subset of firms, which means that it's going to choose the measure of this subset. So from how many firms I want to buy from 2%, 3%, 4%, and also the composition of these firms. I want to buy from relatively smaller firms, from relatively bigger firms, and so on and so forth. So this is how the government is going to operate. What are going to be the instruments that the government has to actually implement these targets? We're going to assume that a firm in T, if wants to sell to the government in T plus 1, okay, so this DIT plus 1 is an indicator variable that is telling you whether you are active in this procurement market, coming back to Enzo's language, okay? So in order to be active into the procurement market, in order to be able to sell something, this DT needs to be equal to 1 tomorrow. But if you want this DIT to be equal to 1 tomorrow, you have to activate it. And if you want to activate it, the way in which you can activate it is by increasing the amount of resources that you invest. This amount of resources is BT. So we think of BT as hiring lawyers, hiring consulting companies that are going to help you to deal with paperwork and so on and so forth. So for example, there is this recent article in a Spanish newspaper that is saying, okay, the small firms are complaining a lot because there's all this money coming from COVID recovery, but they have to hire people just to help them with filling this paperwork to access to these projects. Okay, so this BIT is what it represents. It's the amount of investment that you have to do to increase the probability of being able to sell to the market, to the government tomorrow. So we're going to assume that this probability is going to be increasing in B. So if you invest more, you're going to have a higher probability, but it's kind of concave. So there are diminishing returns, diminishing marginal returns from actually investing this B. Okay, so this eta 0, which is a parameter, is one of the instruments the government has, is going to measure the average probability. Okay, so if eta 0 is higher, it means that it's going to be easier for all firms to increase the probability, conditional on the same amount of investment. Eta 1 is gonna drive the composition of firms. For example, if eta 1 is equal to 0, this means that the allocation of contracts is gonna be random. How much B you put into the table is not going to matter for whether you win or not. And because there is selection in productivity in an asset, this is going to change the composition of firms that end up selling to the government. So the type of counterfactuals we're going to be running are going to be on eta 0 and eta 1, which change both the average probability and the composition of firms that actually get access to procurement. Any questions about this slide? It's a very simple way. So coming back to persistence, which I think is many of the questions you guys ask. For example, we could impose some persistence directly into this function, saying that the probability of selling to the government is a function of your investment today, but also whether you sold to the government yesterday. We could do that. Coming back to Enzo's question, something we could do is allow for this B to be a stock as opposed to a flow. Okay, so you invest, but even if you are not successful, you can use these resources tomorrow because it's, you are becoming better at selling to the government. We're not allowing for that. And the reason is because our model, even with just very simple specification, is going to generate persistent enough, some persistence that is enough as compared to the data along the same magnitude. Okay, let me go fast. This is very standard. We're going to assume firms are owned by entrepreneurs, and these entrepreneurs are going to solve like a dynamic problem. They just want to maximize the amount of discounted utility in a very simple way. So there's going to be the budget constraint, which is going to be how much you consume at a given point in time, how many resources you put into the table to increase the probability to sell to the government, the amount of capital you want to carry on for tomorrow, and the amount of debt has to be lower or equal than the revenue of the firm and depreciated capital, repayment of the debt, and some tax. And this tax is just going to be used for the government to actually collect all the money you need to buy procurement. So we're actually killing firms exogenously, and this theta is going to be the exogenous survival probability. That's why it enters into the discount factor. And we're assuming that firms are financially constrained. So the amount of debt that they can have at a given point in time is going to be a function of the assets, of the amount of capital the firm has, which is kind of standard, and the amount of earnings that the firm has. And these earnings are going to be differentiated into the earnings coming from selling to the government, which is like right here, and selling to the private sector, which is right there. So under some assumptions on the timing of the model, and in particular under the assumption, which is very standard in the literature, that you learn about your productivity before you choose the amount of capital that you want to have, you can write the model in this way. You can define net worth as being just capital minus debt. Okay, so you can just define net worth like this. And then you can just write the model in terms of net worth. Okay, so you say the amount of consumption you want to have, the amount of investment you want to accumulate for, to increase the probability for tomorrow, and the amount of net worth you want to carry out. It's going to be a function of the repayment of this net worth plus the principal plus the amount of profits that you get once you discount the taxes that you have to pay. Okay, and then the collateral constraint is written in a different way, which is the amount of capital that you can have at a given point in time is going to be a function of your net worth and the function of your earnings. And then the only thing that is kind of annoying is that then there is kind of a mapping between the parameters, first order principal parameters that I showed you before and the parameters that I'm showing you right now. Okay, but these transformations are monotonic, so it's kind of nice because you can think of Fiji as being the same of this bar Fiji. Yeah.
Quick question regarding to this formulation. So you made a distinction between the earnings-based loans versus the ones that are related to assets or collateral. So I'm thinking on this formulation and the way that the credit market works. I don't know if you are considering that that earning-based type of credit is for working capital, and the one that is collateralized is more related to investment. Do you consider this in this type of formulation? No?
We don't, and I think it's important. So I mean, this is an open debate. So people are now thinking about the composition of credit. Okay, so people are thinking a lot about this right-hand side of this constraint. They're thinking about how important this earning base is, how important capital is, whether firms use one for some projects, whether firms use the other one for some other projects. So we're not going to get into it. So right now, we don't have working capital. We just have capital in the model. We could potentially have like labor and intermediate inputs, and we could think of working capital. But in any case, I don't think for this project it's actually important to map every specific type of credit into any specific type of project or type of factor of production. But I think maybe relevant, and maybe in practice that's how it works. Maybe in practice, firms finance working capital using this kind of account receivables type of credit, which may be kind of this earning base, and they finance capital using this asset base. We don't know. Because in the credit registry, the only thing that you know is the type of loan, but you don't know whether the loan is actually mapping into one of the factors of production or the others. So just using credit registry and balance sheet data, you cannot construct this network of credit and loans into the use of factors of production, which I think is what you're asking. What the short answer is we cannot do much about it.
But it could be just an idea. It could be related to sectors. For instance, projects related to construction may ask you to have some collateral to finance your first investment, which is more related to
it could be
the land and stuff like that, and then you buy your stuff using revolving lines.
It could be, and this is part of the discussion that is taking place these days. Like some people are saying, maybe this asset base is particularly important for sectors like construction, and for some other sectors, maybe not. And that's precisely what you're saying. In construction, if you really want to start operating, then maybe you really need an asset base. And then for the day-to-day operations, you can rely more on the earning base. I agree with you completely. But that's not something we're exploring. Across sectors, at some point, we did something, and we didn't find like super huge difference across sectors. So that's why we wanted to keep it like one sector. But I sympathize with the idea that maybe exploring variation across sectors may be important for some aspect of the analysis. Okay, so then
super quick. Just
please, Ernesto.
Just one quick clarification. So you're interpreting the taxes as proportional on profits. It's not lump sum, it's not, so the tax structure is proportional on profits. That's it.
Yeah, and this is key. This is key not for the counterfactuals we are doing. We are doing kind of something crazy, which is everything that the government spends in this economy, which is 12% of GDP, which is government, is going to be on the back on entrepreneurs. And this is kind of crazy, right? Because we know that a lot of government expenditure is not financed through corporate taxation, which is what we're assuming. But I don't think this is important for us because we're not going to be changing the amount of government expenditure. In our counterfactuals, government expenditure is going to be fixed. You see what I'm saying? So we don't have to take a stand on whether this increasing government expenditure is affecting entrepreneurs more than consumers. We're fixing the amount of government expenditure, and the only thing we're doing is changing the allocation of this government expenditure across different firms.
So profits are not being affected by a firm selling to the government or not?
On the aggregate, not. It's going to be affected to the extent that this change in the policy is going to affect some firms more than others. But somehow, how much the government is taking from entrepreneurs on the aggregate is going to be unaffected. Because
if you want, we can discuss about this later. But I thought that you would take some lump sum taxes to get rid of that effect and concentrate only on the financial friction. But
okay, we can talk about it. I don't think that's affecting our results for the type of counterfactors we run. I agree with you that if we wanted to run other counterfactors, like for example, you increase government expenditure and see what happens, then that may matter a lot. But if you still think that it matters, I would be super happy to discuss it. Okay, so then we're gonna split the problem into a static problem and a dynamic problem. How much time do I have? I'm running super late.
We've been having a lot of good discussions, so I think we can go for 15 minutes more. 15
minutes. Okay, I'll try to get it done by then. Okay. Anyway, so once you have this formulation, which is pretty standard in the context of these models, okay, something that is good about it is you can split the problem into a static problem. So at a given point in time, you see the amount of net worth that a firm has, and you can decide the amount of capital that you want. In our model, this static problem is going to be a bit more complicated, okay? Because at a given point in time, the state variables are not only productivity and net worth, which are kind of the standard variables in this type of models, but also there is a third state variable, which is whether you are active in procurement or not, okay? So this is the variable that maybe Enzo was thinking about, whether you are into the procurement sector or not, which is this D. If D is equal to 0, then the static problem becomes very similar to the standard one, because then there is not this demand, and then this kg is equal to 0. So this becomes a very standard problem. If D is equal to 1, then the firm doesn't have only to choose the amount of capital that the firm wants, but also how much this capital is allocated into the public sector and the private sector. Okay, so there's kind of this allocation of capital within the firm that becomes relevant whenever the firm is active in procurement. And then this lambda, which is kind of just the multiplier, is also going to be an important role. Okay, it's going to tell you how much the firm, how much constrained the firm is. So just to give you an intuition about how this static problem works. So this is going to be kind of the standard marginal product of capital, this left-hand side. Okay. In this type of model, it's going to depend on lambda, which is the financial multiplier. Okay, like the Lagrangian multiplier of the constraint. So if the firm is very constrained, then the actual cost of capital, the effective cost of capital is very high. Okay, but in this model, because of this earning base, this is going to be discounted by how much extra you can borrow if you produce more, and this is capturing by this lambda in the denominator. Okay, so somehow if you produce more, you can relax the constraint, or you can borrow a little bit more, which is going to push down the effective cost of capital that you have. For the type of, for the other sector, is going to be identical. You really want to equalize the marginal product to the effective cost of capital that the firm is facing. Now, if the firm is unconstrained, so if lambda is equal to 0, then we are in a first best type of world. So every single firm equalizes the marginal product to the cost of capital, which is simply R plus delta, which is the same for all firms. So there is no misallocation at all in this economy. But if lambda is bigger than 0, then the firm is financially constrained. So firms that have a high lambda, because this right-hand side is going to be increasing in lambda, firms with high lambda are going to have an inefficiently high marginal product. So those firms that are constrained are going to be operating an inefficiently high marginal product, and the extent that, to the extent that lambda is different across firms, this is going to create some dispersion of marginal products, which is what the literature refers to as misallocation across firms. But in this context in which firms can actually sell to two different sectors, you're going to find another source of misallocation, which is misallocation within the firm. So let me tell you what I mean by that. What the firm is optimally going to do is to equalize these marginal products. Okay, so the firm wants to make sure that within the firm, the two marginal products are equalized. Otherwise, this is not efficient. So if you equalize these two guys, you're going to get this equation. So in a world in which lambda is equal to 0, the firm is just equalizing marginal products, so everything is efficient within the firm. But in a world in which lambda is bigger than 0, in a world in which the firm is financially constrained, the firm is going to end up overproducing for the sector that actually provides more collateral. So what is going to happen is that if Fiji is bigger than VP, the firm is going to oversell to the public sector because it's going to relax the constraint a bit more. So somehow the marginal product at which the firm is going to operate is going to be inefficiently low for the public sector as compared to that in the private sector. So this is what we refer as the misallocation within the firm. It's just to make sure that people kind of are in line with how this static model is working. So what are the effects of
just one thing, and this is how you just pin down these parameters, the way that you say?
No, this is just one because we don't have data on KG and KP. We only have data on K. So we cannot rely on KG and KP. That would be awesome, but we don't know how much capital the firm is using to deliver the private versus the public sector. But this is just, this has no empirical content, but I wanted to make sure that people understand the logic behind the model, which is that the firm faces this kind of, optimal choice of choosing resources across sectors, which may be important later for something I'm gonna emphasize right now. Okay, so then what about, imagine you want to think about the shock of procurement. Imagine I make D equal to 0. I make it D equal to 1. What happens? First of all, it's good for all firms. So all firms are going to increase their profits. Okay, so it's always good. But it's going to be increasing with S. And this comes back to the scale story. If you are a big firm, then you get this, you are into the procurement sector. And because you can deliver big projects, the change in profits is going to be larger. And if you are financially constrained, this is also going to depend on net worth. If you're a very financially concerned firm, even if you get into procurement, the type of projects you're going to be able to deliver are very small, so the change in profits is not as high. And this is actually what is going to drive the selection that I told you before, okay? Then what about the production spillovers? So what about how much the production to the private sector goes down whenever you get a contract? For unconstrained firms, nothing happens. The firms are always going to be operating at optimal scale. If you allow me to sell to a different market, I'm not going to change what I do in the other market. But if the firm is constrained, then it's going to be affected. It's going to be kind of this spillover, this crowding out effect within the firm. I'm not going to become financially unconstrained, so my scale is kind of pinned down by my assets and the amount of earnings. So if I really want to start selling to one sector, I have to decrease the amount of sales to the other sector. Okay, and the idea is that if Fiji is bigger than VP, this mechanism is going to be offset. So this spillover that is negative in the short run is going to become weaker whenever Fiji is very big. Why? Because when Fiji is very big, selling to the government actually allows you to increase your scale a little bit, so you don't have to push down that much in the private sector. Okay, so this is kind of the value function of the firm, which is very standard. So I'm gonna go very fast. So this is the value function that depends on the 3 state variables. Something that is kind of new is the fact that here the value function tomorrow is gonna be kind of a convex combination of whether you can sell to the government or not. Okay, in which the weights is kind of the probability. So remember, V with a 1 here is a V under you can sell to the government. A V with a 0 here is a V under a case in which you cannot sell to the government. So this is what the value function is telling you. Okay, so this is interesting. So this is, yeah.
I have a very, very basic question.
But
so for a firm that has a procurement contract with the government and is not financially constrained, that firm has an optimal scale that is larger than the same firm without the procurement contract, right? Because they are facing a higher demand.
Yeah, so they have a higher size, okay, but in the private sector it's still the same. So the size in the private sector is fixed, but because now they sell to the government, the overall size is bigger.
Exactly. So if that firm next period doesn't get the procurement contract, will it be decumulating capital?
It will decrease the amount of capital. Yeah, it will decrease the amount of.
Okay.
It will.
So you will have firms that are accumulating and firms that are actually decreasing the amount of capital in the distribution of firms in the steady state.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. But that's also that. Absolutely, that's actually also true. That's also true in the standard model without procurement. In the standard model without procurement, you're going to have that firms that are very productive and are very big, they're actually going to be eating a lot. So they're going to be accumulating capital also. So that's going to be, I mean, that's kind of what you need to have a stationary distribution. Like some firms are going to accumulate capital and some firms are going to accumulate capital, and that's what is giving you this. Now, in the procurement case, we're going to find that that's actually going to be the consequence as well from the fact that you were selling before and not selling now. So that's true.
Good. Thanks.
Okay, so what about the dynamic problem? So here we're going to have the standard Euler equation coming from this model. Okay, so one of the reasons why the firm is going to accumulate assets is because if the firm is financially constrained, okay, you're going to have this extra return of capital, which is going to come from this increase in profit. So if you're financially constrained, okay, you want to make sure that if you get a high productivity shock, and that's going to make you even more financially constrained, you want to increase assets just to make sure that you escape out of these constraints. Okay, that's one channel through which you can accumulate assets, or through which you can become less financially constrained. Another channel through which you can become less financially constrained is by increasing the amount of B, because increasing the amount of B, it's going to allow you to sell to the government, which itself is going to allow you to make more profits, which that would be this kind of equation right here. So there is kind of two mechanisms through which you can escape financial constraints. One is the asset-based constraint, which is accumulating wealth, which is kind of standard in these models. And the second one is the fact that you can increase the amount of investment to sell to the government, which may allow you to be bigger in the long run. But something that we find is that entrepreneurs with lower levels of net worth, so firms that are more financially constrained, are going to rely much more on the standard channel. Why? Because of the scale effect that I told you before. If you're a very constrained firms, then selling to the government is going to help you much, because the scale at which you can sell to the government is low. So that's not going to help you much in increasing the amount of borrowing that you have. So smaller firms are going to rely much more on the standard mechanism, which is just accumulating assets over time. Okay, let me tell you about the calibration, and then counterfactual, it will be super fast. So we have this borrowing constraint, which is kind of the constraint I showed you before. So you can do some manipulations. Okay, so you can write the amount of debt the firm has as a function of capital, as a function of total sales. So this is total sales, like the sum private sector versus public sector, and the amount of sales to the public sector. Okay, and the amount of sales to the public sector is going to be multiplied by the difference between phi G and phi P. So if you divide by capital all the terms in this equation and take first differences, then you find this nice equation here, which is telling you that the change in leverage, okay, of a given firm is going to be a function of the change in revenue divided by capital, plus something multiplied by the change in revenue from the public sector divided by capital, okay? And this only holds for financially constrained firms in the model. So what we're going to do in the data is we're going to try to focus on sets of firms that are more likely to be financially constrained, like young firms or firms with low net worth, and we're going to run this regression. And what we find is that this coefficient right here is positive, okay? And in particular, is 0.72, which is suggesting that phi G is bigger than phi P, according to the model, okay? And we run other type of equations that are less model-driven, but somehow the idea is that you see how much leverage is going up or how much credit is going up. You control for the amount of total sales in the economy, or the change in total sales of the firm, and you see to what extent, even conditional on the change in total sales of the firm, procurement still matters in accounting for this change in leverage. And the extent of this relationship is going to tell you the extent of this phi G relative to phi P. So that's the idea. And then phi K is kind of following the standard procedure in the literature, which is targeting the credit to capital ratio in the economy. Okay, so some other key parameters. YG, we just calibrated to match 12% of GDP. Again, this is kind of the scale of the government demand. To identify eta 0, we make sure that in equilibrium, MG is the fraction of firms from which governments buy is equal to 3.8%, which is what we can measure in our data, like also using some surveys. So this is kind of the number we have for the Spanish economy. In the Spanish economy, 4% of the firms sell to the government. And then to identify, Okay, and then to identify eta 1, what we want to make sure is that the selection pattern in the data is consistent with the model. And to do that, we make sure that the firms that select themselves into procurement are the same in the model and in the data. And in particular, we find in the data that bigger firms tend to select more into procurement, and we try to match that in the model as well. That's how we do it. We can talk more about the details later. Okay, what about the results? So first, we find that there is a strong selection into procurement, both in productivity and assets. So this is what we were discussing before. There are some differences in productivity in the public sector and the private sector. We find that productivity, TFP, tends to be bigger in the public sector, mostly coming from this selection, because only productive firms and firms that are not financially constrained are the ones that participate more into procurement. So TFP, if you want, seems to be larger in government sector than in the private sector, to a magnitude of 21% difference, okay? Okay, what about the counterfactuals? And then I will conclude. So we just ran this counterfactual. What if governments buy smaller projects from more firms? And in particular, we just say, let's change eta 0. So we're gonna keep all the parameters constant except for eta 0 and YG. So let's say increase eta 0 such that MG is going to go from 4% to 14%. It's like increase the fraction of firms from which the government buys from 4% to 14%, okay, by 10 percentage points. And then we say, okay, because if we do that in the model, government expenditure is going to go up, just mechanically, we have to adjust, we have to recalibrate YG, which is the demand. We want to make contracts smaller so that PG times YG becomes constant. So the government expenditure overall remains constant, remains 12% of GDP. And then we're going to keep constant the rest of parameters. So that's the exercise. The exercise is make contracts smaller, but increase the fraction of firms from which you buy. That's kind of the idea. So the average project in this counterfactual is going to go down by 27%. So again, projects are smaller. And what we're going to find is that the selection effect becomes weaker. So now this procurement premium, which is how big procurement firms are relative to non-procurement firms, goes down by 29%. So there is now smaller firms getting into procurement that were not operating before. So what do we find? So let me focus on the static partial equilibrium effects, which is like, because of this crowding out effect, these new procurement firms that are more likely to be financially constrained than before. Before, only big firms tend to sell to the government, which means they are not financially constrained. Now you buy from a higher pool of firms. Firms are more likely to be financially constrained, those firms from which you buy, which means that the crowding out effect hits, so they decrease the amount of output in the private sector. Okay, and this generates a fall in the total output in the private sector of around 1%. Okay, there is some demand externality coming from the fact that these firms are going to demand less capital because they want to decrease their amount of operations in the private sector. But because capital is produced out of the private good, there is a fall in demand, which means that there is kind of this demand externality, which causes another 1% fall in the private sector. Okay, it's kind of, that's what we call the general equilibrium effect of this effect. And then the full dynamic effect, and I will conclude with this slide, is telling you that, first of all, there is a positive effect for a small firm. So these firms that now can sell to the government are going to accumulate more assets. So they're going to have higher capital stock in the steady state. And this is the story that people have in mind to justify these policies, like in the US. Okay, we should buy from small firms because this is going to help them to grow, and this is going to make them to be closer to the optimal scale in the long run. So this is true in our model. Okay, but big firms, because of the decrease in precautionary motives, are going to actually decrease the amount of capital they accumulate. Okay, and the idea here is that now they know that they live in an economy in which they are less likely to be financially constrained. This comes back to Luciano's question. This motive to accumulate capital, which is to make sure that in case I get the contract, I'm not financially constrained, this incentive disappears to some extent. Because I know that even if I get a contract, I probably will be able to deliver because contracts are small. So these big, relatively big firms actually accumulate this amount of assets. And that's going to drive down capital accumulation by a lot in this economy. And that's what is going to generate a fall in capital accumulation of 4%, which itself is going to decrease GDP by a lot, okay, like 4%. Okay, we have some results on TFP as well. Let me skip them. I'm happy to talk about them, but I'm really running out of time. So just to make sure that people are on board with the final number, we find that this type of policy reduces GDP by 4%, okay, which is a big number. We cannot say much about welfare. We know that capital accumulation sometimes is, in the context of uncertainty, is not a good proxy for welfare. So we don't know whether this is social optimal or not. We just find that GDP goes down by a lot. And remember, this is just coming from changing the fraction of firms from which you buy and changing the composition. This is keeping constant government expenditure. Just this simple policy of changing the allocation can have important implications for GDP. And then I will shut up. And sorry about being super late.
Thanks, Manuel. This was great. The discussion throughout the talk was great. So I think it was good to kind of keep it a bit longer. So I think that was good. So we have a couple of minutes for a couple of extra questions. So feel free to fire away.
I have a couple of small questions. Have you run the same counterfactual, but having the same, I think it was the same parameter for the borrowing constraint for private and public?
Oh, yeah. Good point. So that's something we're actually putting into the paper right now. So the idea is the following. All the mechanics of the model, all the mechanisms that we have in the model qualitatively would still be present if Fiji was equal to VP. Okay, but kind of the way it works is the following. If you think about, for example, this negative spillover. This negative spillover is telling you if the firm starts selling to the government, Okay, now they're going to reduce the amount of output in the private sector. But the extent of this spillover depends crucially on by how much you can increase your scale when you sell to the government sector. So if Fiji is infinity, I'm going to the extreme, okay, but imagine Fiji is infinity, then the spillover will disappear because you sell $1 to the public sector, which means that the spillover doesn't hit you because you can increase your scale so much that you don't have to do anything with the private sector. Somehow selling to the government makes you unconstrained, right like this, if Fiji is equal to infinity. Of course, this is kind of an extreme case, but if Fiji is sufficiently big, then the extent of these spillovers is weaker and weaker and weaker. So when we do the counterfactual you have in mind, which is when we do the exercise that you have in mind, which is fix Fiji equal to VP and run the same counterfactuals, we actually find even more negative effects of the policy. Because the fact that Fiji is bigger than VP is decreasing the extent of these negative spillovers, and it's also allowing firms to accumulate assets faster. So being Fiji bigger than VP mitigates the negative effects of the policy by a lot, actually. Okay, I don't have the exact numbers in mind, but I think we were getting like the fall in GDP would be 50% larger if Fiji was bigger than VP. Okay, so Fiji bigger than VP matters for mitigating the negative effects of this counterfactual. So it matters that the government provides flexibility to the economy. And I think this is very important because if you think about poor countries, countries in which governments don't have good reputation, this type of policies may be much worse than in a country like Spain or the US, where governments actually provide flexibility. So that's kind of the way we think about it.
Ernesto, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. So it seems to me that the model is super rich. It provides very rich predictions that are actually testable to provide some sort of external validity. So you know the model better, but it seems to me that the facts that you show at the beginning, there should be some patterns that are driving those facts coming from characteristics of either of the contracts or of the firms that are observable for you. So that's a suggestion and a question whether you have done something of that.
Absolutely. So we have done a lot. I mean, we have to do it in a more systematic way. I mean, I think something that you are emphasizing, which I think is super valid point, is the fact that we're not using the facts that I showed you before. We're not using them directly for the calibration. So in that sense, it's nice. We know that qualitatively things match because we wanted to replicate those facts, right? So we know that the extent of spillovers has the same path. We know that capital accumulation follows the same pattern. We know that projects are persistent, so we know that goes in the same line qualitatively. Now, I think it's still up to us, and I think we really have to do it more systematically, quantitatively, to see how far the model is from the patterns. Because we're not using those patterns a lot, like these regressions that I showed you at the beginning, we're not using them for the calibration at all. For example, something that is important is that our model is going to predict something about the importance of earning base versus asset base, which we're not using because in the calibration we're just using this changing leverage, so we're not using that numbers directly from the data, and that's something we can check directly. Of course, my bias prior is the model is going to do relatively well, but I agree with you, we have to do it more systematically.
For instance, is a prediction of the model that the procurement contract should relax more financial constraints of bigger firms? I'm not exactly sure about that because it has to do with selection.
So something for sure, something that is gonna happen for sure is that there's gonna be a heterogeneous effect across the lambdas. So for firms that are sufficiently big, they are not financially constrained. Okay, so then getting a procurement contract is just gonna increase the amount of operations they have, but this is not gonna affect them by any means. Now, it might be the case that some firms are financially unconstrained. Okay, they are sufficiently big, but when they get a contract, they actually become constrained. So you could have in the model that because there is this huge demand shock, it's like getting a huge productivity shock in the standard model. If you're operating with a standard productivity shock, you are unconstrained, but all of a sudden you get a huge productivity shock, which in this case is a demand shock, you actually become unconstrained. You actually become constrained. And this may happen in the model as well. We could actually have relatively big firms that after selling to the government, they become constrained. So their lambda goes to zero, from zero to something positive. I'm just trying to think how we could discipline that empirically. And I think the way we could do it is looking at the change in observables. How the change in observables is different depending on the initial size of the firm, whether the change in total sales or a change in total capital or something like that correlates with the initial level of size of the firm.
The bottom line comment is that since the effect of procurement on firms depends on observable firms' characteristics, this is something you can exploit to do an external validity to the model.
So the only thing we do along those lines is something I mentioned at the beginning, which is we find that the procurement shock is particularly strong for firms that are more likely to be financially constrained. And in the data, we were measuring this as size and age. And the model seems to go in the same direction. When you look at the percentage change in credit coming from a procurement shock, you find that is stronger, that is higher for firms that were initially more financially constrained. But that's the only thing we do. And we should potentially do it more systematically. I agree with you.
Sorry, Manuel, can
Carlos,
I ask you a question?
Absolutely, yeah.
I was thinking about the first conclusion about government contracts being highly pledgeable. I assume that part of this is because sovereign debt is considered to be the safest asset, right? But perhaps in some countries, some risky countries, you could find the other way around. Say, for example, in Nigeria, maybe it's better to get a contract from Exxon or Chevron, a big multinational company, rather than getting a contract with your government, right?
No. I think you're perfectly right. I mean, let me tell you the way we think about it kind of conceptually. So we have this buyer, okay, and we think about this buyer as being a very safe buyer in the sense that it's never going to default. So the bank here, the way we think about it is that if you're selling to the government, the bank knows, okay, the government is always going to pay. For example, in Spain, there was this during the financial crisis, the local governments started not repaying firms. And then at some point, the central government came and paid everyone, okay? That's the way we think about it. And then you're telling me, but how is that different from Walmart? If you're a firm selling to Walmart, then conceptually, that should be exactly the same. I'm a bank. I observe the firm comes to ask for a loan, and this firm is a Walmart supplier. I know Walmart is not going to default. But the way we think about it is like on average, governments tend to be more reliable than private firms on average, and it's particularly so in the context of Spain. But I'm with you completely that if you wanted to think about kind of cross-country type of way of thinking about this analysis, it is not obvious that in a country like the one you mentioned, selling to government is safer than selling to Walmart or whatever company there is in Nigeria. And I agree with you completely. And I think this is interesting from the point of view of our paper, which is the fact that this type of size-dependent policies, okay, as I was mentioning in my answer to Sophia, the results of these size-dependent policies are gonna depend crucially on the extent of the credibility of the government. If the government is not credible at all, then these size-dependent policies are terrible, because they are disincentivizing big firms to accumulate assets, and in exchange is getting you nothing, because this is not relaxing constraints for small firms. So there's no gain from doing those. In countries in which governments are very credible, they can take advantage of that credibility to provide extra credit or to make life easier for small firms, which is kind of the positive effect that we find.